Shalom, shalom. This is Rabbi Moshe Otero, Ways of Israel. We are continuing the series on To Be a Jew. We're going to look at, in this video, Israel and its Torah. The Jewish faith does not stop at the point where God created the heavens and the earth. It starts there, but it continues to acknowledge that I am the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt. He is the living God who continues to play a role even till this day in the life of every single Israelite or Jew. Judaism insists that there is no practical distinction between one who denies the existence of God and one who admits to the existence of God and even to his role in creation, but denies that God has anything to do with this world. The distinction between such views is purely academic, for there are no differentiating implications for human life. In either case, there are no compelling reasons to worship him or to follow his ways, and the opposite is true. Central to the belief in the living God is the Jewish belief that in some spiritual fashion he communicated his will and his commandments to his creatures, whom he endowed with free will, but whom he called to be obedient servants, Oved Hashem. The very essence of Judaism rests upon the acceptance of a spiritual historical event in which our ancestors participated in the spiritual historical event in subsequent spiritual revelation, as well as upon the acceptance of subsequent spiritual revelation to the prophets of Israel. Now, this extraordinary revelation, as it were, or promulgation, occurred at Sinai. The extraordinary event, as we mentioned, is the promulgation of the Ten Commandments out Mount Sinai. 7 weeks following the exodus of the children of Israel from Egypt, God's will was also made manifest in a written Torah, written down by Moses under divine prophecy. During 40-year period after the Exodus, side by side with the 5 books of Moses, known also as the Pentateuch. We believe that God's will was also made manifest on the oral tradition, or the Oral Torah, which also has its source from Sinai, revealed to Moses orally, taught by him to the religious leaders or the elders of Israel. The written in Torah itself alludes to such oral instruction. This is called the oral law or the oral teachings, which clarifies and provides the details of many commandments contained in the written Torah. It was transmitted from generation to generation until finally they're recorded in the 2nd century to become the very cornerstone of what today is called the Talmud. Non-traditionalists regard the Torah as inspired writings of the great men, as a record of man's attempt to reach out to God. But according to this view, there's nothing eternal about the Torah, and nothing are capable of making. If this is the case, then why indeed should it be treated as any more authoritative to the guide to behavior as, say, any more than the embodiment of truth of such ethics as Aristotle, Kant, and Spinoza? It is only a set of man-made tribal laws. Anyone indeed is justified in eliminating whatever no longer suits him. I mean, because of this mindset, changing or amending it strikes the fancy of every generation or religious leader. And this is precisely the rationale that's used by non-traditionalists to justify the far-reaching changes in Jewish practices that they have introduced. And this is why those who deny the Torah are also denied by this very faith of Judaism. And this is why that no matter how one chooses to visualize or understand or comprehend the specific natures of God's revelation to Israel and the prophets, what stands out is that the Torah means anything at all. And it is the record of God reaching out to man, not the reverse. If it possesses any enduring value or truth, the Torah must be seen as the record not of man's spiritual geniuses, but of God's will communicated to mortal and finite man. No interpretation of Judaism is Jewishly valid if it does not position God as the source of the Torah. In other words, the Torah is divinely given. So what is the Torah? What is this which Israel received at Sinai? Technically, it refers to the 5 books of Moses, which is the written law, Torah Shebekatev, which was written, which is the teachings written in such a way that it brings about the teachings of God to man. The scroll upon which it's written is kept in the Holy Ark, and you'll see this in many synagogues. In this Holy Ark, the synagogue is called the Torah Scroll, or a Sefer Torah. In a sense, this is the very constitution of the Jewish people, what makes Israel Israel. Without it, there would be no Jewish people, nor a people called Israel. And here we have this constitution, which was promulgated not by men, but revealed by God. So here we have a divine constitution by God to man on Sinai. By the Torah, it's also meant another part, because it's called Torat, or Torah Shebe'al Peh, the very teachings of the oral law, which Moses received at Sinai, and it was transmitted to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. And we see this also elaborated in our Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Father, chapter 1, verse 1. Now, the oral law includes other finer points of the commandments, the detailed general principles contained in scriptures, the way which the commandments were to be applied. For example, the Torah forbids work on Shabbat. What constitutes work? Well, how shall work be defined for the purpose of the Sabbath? Except for those several references to such tasks as gathering wood, kindling fire, cooking and baking, the written Torah does not say how to keep it. But it comes to the oral law, the oral teachings, which does. The written Torah commands the animals needed for food to be killed, as I have commanded thee. How shall this slaughtering take place? Well, the regulations regarding how the slaughter of animals is not indicated at all in the written law, but in the oral Torah. The written Torah commands us, for example, to bind the sign on your hands and frontlet between your eyes. This is something definitely taught in Torah, and this is reference to the phylacteries, the tefillins. Yet we have no indication by the written law how these tefillins were to be created, how they were to be worn, how were they to be wrapped on one's arm and head. But the oral Torah does. The written Torah prescribes capital punishment for various crimes. The legal rules and procedures had to be followed before such a verdict could be handed down. What were the limitations? What was the written law? What does it say? The oral Torah does indicate, but not the written law. Ultimately, the oral Torah was reduced to writing during the 2nd century of the Common Era. It was incorporated into what's called the Mishnah, which is the monumental records of the minutes and case discussion and legal debate conducted by the sages. The Mishnah and the Gemara together makes the Talmud. The Torah, whether written or oral, is the teaching that directs man how to live his daily life. It is also concerned with every aspect of the human life. Ritual, laws generally thought as religious observance, are also part of the total complex of the commandments. The commandments are of the Torah, its statutes, regulations, cover the entire range of human and social behavior. Even its non-legal and non-statutory section stresses the importance of spiritual truth and conveys insight into the finer extra-legal ethical and moral norms and behavior. In other words, it not only tells you, instructs you how to live your life, but what are the ways to live a more moral and upright life. The rest of the books of the Hebrew Bible, written over a period of many centuries, consist of the prophets, the Nevi'im. It consists of the writings, sacred literatures, the Ketuvim, and these books convey the very teachings of the prophets in context of Israel's history over a period of several hundred years. Now, they tell us of the prophets, their visions of God, and their ongoing struggle to promote that allegiance among the people of the teachings of the Torah, of their struggles against many of the false prophets and priests who often misled the people and turned them away from God and Torah, about movements that arose even within the people of Israel that were heretical, that was completely deviance of our own Torah law. And thus we have this incorporated as well in the oral law. The deepest religious sentiments, the Torah, the writings, the prophets are altogether referred to as the Tanakh. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketubim. This is what the non-Jewish people, Christians, usually call as the Old Testament, but which Jews have always referred to as their only testament, because it is. In fact, in the broadest sense, however, the study of Torah refers not only to Scripture, not only to the oral law, but the entire body of rabbinical legislations and interpretation based upon the Torah and developed over centuries. For the Torah was always a living law, applicable and flexible in every century. Though these obvious is the result of human efforts and part of an integral Torah itself grants authoritative status even to every generation and its leaders. As it says in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 10 and 11, "And ye shall observe and do according to all that they shall teach you, according to the law that they shall teach you, and according to the judgment that they will tell you, you shall do." In other words, we have here the support and sustenance of where the oral law and the rabbinical teachings take strength. Torah is the embodiment of the Jewish faith, and it contains terms of his covenant with God. It is literally what makes a Jew a Jew. To refer to all of these different errors as being accountable is also mentioned, and they will be held accountable for their deviance. Now, in general, the Torah of Israel includes the scriptures, the Torah scriptures, the oral Torah, the Talmud, the rabbinical legislation, and it becomes even more decisive in that. As a matter of fact, when you look at the rabbinical, there's a series of categories under the rabbinical, which includes areas which mentions which the Rambam mentions, that explains the category of real transmission, which involves even verses and application of every verse in the Torah, Halacha leMoshe from Mount Sinai, which refers to that this teaching was coming from Sinai and passed down. And then you have other laws that deals with what they call Sefarah or Savara, which are decisions based on legal precedents. Then you have Gezerot, which are decrees enacted by the rabbis. And you have, in today's world, Takanot, which are applied during a period of time of only 500 years maximum, like we have in the Takanot of Rabbi Gershon, which prohibited polygamy, and that Takanot has expired. The explanation of this and many other areas is focused on the words of Proverbs, chapter 22, verse 24, and it fulfills the very words of Mishle when it tells us regarding the minhag, or the customs of our fathers. So all of this is part of Torah. It's not like some would say we exclude the rabbi's law and only include the written law. There are many teachings of the rabbis that are exposed or explained in the Talmud, and this is also part of the very living words of God. This is Rabbi Moshe Tero. We will continue the study of to be a Jew and why it's required. Why do we need to believe in the written and oral law to be part of the Jewish people? More in our coming videos. Shalom, shalom.